Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today, we invite you on a journey unlike any other. It's not just a lesson in vocabulary or grammar. It's a lesson in resilience, sacrifice, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. Our story is about a man who spent 27 years behind bars, but never once allowed the walls of a prison to break his will. A man who walked out of captivity not with vengeance, but with forgiveness. A man whose name became a beacon of hope around the world. Yes, today, we bring you the extraordinary story of Nelson Mandela, one of the most revered leaders in human history. But this is not just a political biography. This is a tale of transformation, of a child born under the shadows of colonialism, who grew into a warrior for justice, a prisoner of conscience, and finally a symbol of peace. And as you listen, you'll not only improve your English, you'll come to understand how language, like leadership, has the power to unite, to heal, and to change the world. This story will take you through villages lost in time, courtrooms trembling with tension, and dark cells filled with silent strength. You'll witness both injustice and triumph. You'll feel the cold grip of oppression and the warm light of reconciliation. By the end of this journey, you'll not just know more English, you'll know what it truly means to stand for something greater than yourself. Get ready for one of the most powerful and motivational stories of our time. Let's begin the journey of Nelson Mandela. The sun was rising over the rolling hills of the Transkei in the Eastern Cape of South Africa when a boy named Nelson Mandela was born into the royal Thembu family in 1918. His name, Nkosi, meant pulling the branch of a tree, a curious foreshadowing of how he would one day shake the very roots of an unjust system. Although born into tribal royalty, young Ralila's life was far from a life of riches. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakeni-Iswa, was a respected chief and counselor to the king. Yet their wealth was not measured in gold or land, but in pride, tradition, and values passed down through generations. Mandela's early days were filled with the sounds of cattle bells, tribal stories around the fire, and the songs of the Xhosa people. He was raised in the rolling green hills of Kunu, where boys learned by observing their elders about leadership, honor, and resistance. But beneath the peaceful rhythms of tribal life, a storm was always gathering. South Africa was under the rule of British colonialists and later the harsh apartheid regime. Indigenous South Africans were increasingly stripped of their rights, their land, and even their identity. The native black population, millions strong, were reduced to shadows in their own homeland. When Mandela was just 9, his father died. This tragedy changed everything. According to custom, young Mandela was sent to live with Chief John Jintaba, the acting regent of the Thembu nation, at the Great Place in Kekeswini. It was there that Mandela's world widened. In the regal court of the chief, he saw not only the ceremonies of power, but the dilemmas and burdens of leadership. He heard whispers of resistance. He listened to tribal leaders speak of dignity, justice, and the slow suffocation of black people under white rule. But still, at this point, Mandela was just a boy, absorbing everything, questioning much, but not yet ready to act. He received a rare gift for a black child at the time, a Western education. At Clarkberry, and later Helltown, he began to see a world beyond the traditions of his childhood. He read about African chieftains, British kings, and, most importantly, freedom struggles across the world. At Fort Hare University, a prestigious institution for black South Africans, Mandela began studying law. It was here that the first spark of rebellion ignited. When student elections were manipulated by the administration, Mandela joined a boycott. The administration expelled him. This small act of defiance would become the first in a lifetime of resistance. But that was only the beginning. An even greater challenge awaited him. not in the hills of the Transkei, but in the heart of a brutal, segregated nation. When Mandela moved to Johannesburg in the 1940s, he entered a different world, loud, restless, and boiling with the tensions of inequality. The city had gleaming white neighborhoods, paved with privilege, and dark, overcrowded townships like Soweto, where black South Africans lived under oppressive laws and constant surveillance. Mandela, like all black men, had to carry a passbook, a document used to control and restrict movement. If he was caught without it, he could be arrested. At any moment, a police officer could demand to see it, and if his papers were not in order, he could be jailed. This was not just inconvenience. It was humiliation designed to remind every black citizen that they were lesser in their own country. In Johannesburg, Mandela worked as a night watchman and a clerk before completing his law degree through correspondence. Eventually, he became one of South Africa's first black lawyers. With Oliver Tambo, he opened the country's first black law firm. Their office became a lifeline for those who had nowhere else to turn. Mothers evicted from their homes, workers abused by their employers, and children arrested for petty violations. But Mandela's sense of justice was no longer satisfied by legal victories alone. In 1944, he joined the African National Congress, ANC, a political organization fighting for the rights of black South Africans. At first, the ANC pursued change through petitions and polite appeals to the white government. But Mandela and other young leaders like Walter Sisulu and Anton Lembede believed this was not enough. They formed the ANC Youth League, a new generation that believed in mass mobilization, civil disobedience, and unshakable defiance. Mandela soon found himself organizing strikes, protests, and defiance campaigns. He stood in courtrooms during the day, and in meetings lit by candlelight at night. The price of resistance was growing. In 1952, during the defiance campaign, Mandela was arrested and sentenced to 9 months of hard labor, suspended for 2 years. But the warning signs were clear. The apartheid regime was watching him closely. Mandela faced not just the threat of prison, but also betrayal. Some allies became informants. Some friends turned fearful. But he pressed on. The government tried to silence him by banning him from gatherings, from leaving Johannesburg, even from being quoted publicly. But Mandela found ways to keep organizing, keep speaking, keep fighting. He knew that change would not come without pain. But how much pain would it take? And how far was he willing to go? That question would soon be answered in a moment that would change everything. A moment when Mandela realized that peaceful protest alone was no longer enough. By the mid-1950s, Nelson Mandela had become a thorn in the side of South Africa's apartheid government. To his supporters, he was a rising symbol of resistance. To the regime, he was dangerous, calm, articulate, defiant. But Mandela's struggle was never personal. It was a mission, born not out of hatred, but of duty. A duty to millions of voiceless black South Africans, forced into silence by law. In 1955, the African National Congress, ANC, together with other anti-apartheid groups, gathered at Kliptown to adopt a new vision, the Freedom Charter. It boldly proclaimed, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. These were dangerous words in a country where only one race held all power. Mandela stood proudly among the authors of this dream. But dreams, under apartheid, were treated as crimes. The government struck back hard. In 1956, Mandela and 155 other activists were arrested and charged with high treason, a trial that would last for 4 long years. During that time, Mandela balanced a whirlwind of roles: political leader, defense strategist, husband, father, and increasingly, a man being pulled away from personal comforts toward the edge of revolution. He was constantly followed. His phone was tapped. He would return home to find police searching through his children's toys. His marriage with Evelyn Mays, his first wife, eventually crumbled under the strain. He later married Winnie Madikizela, a passionate social worker who would become both his companion and a political force of her own. The trial ended in 1961, with all defendants acquitted. But the victory was bittersweet. Mandela knew the apartheid regime was not relenting. It was preparing for war. And so, for the first time, Mandela made the most difficult decision of his life. For years, he had championed nonviolent resistance, inspired by Gandhi and moral courage. But the state was escalating violence. Peaceful protests were now being met with bullets. In 1960, at the town of Sharperville, police opened fire on a crowd of demonstrators. 69 people died. Many were shot in the back as they fled. Mandela was devastated. But more than that, he was changed. If peaceful protest was crushed by guns, was it still moral to ask people not to fight back? In 1961, he co-founded the militant wing of the ANC, called Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation. It would target government infrastructure, never people, with sabotage. Their mission, to force the regime to the table. To lead it, Mandela went underground. He wore disguises, traveled in secret, moved between safe houses. The press nicknamed him the Black Pimpernel for his ability to vanish just before the police arrived. But he knew he couldn't run forever. He was not a fugitive. He was a soldier of justice, and he was ready to pay the price. In 1962, Mandela left South Africa illegally to meet African leaders and seek support. He received military training in Ethiopia, met revolutionaries in Algeria, and addressed the Organization of African Unity. But upon returning home, Mandela was captured. He was arrested near Howick and charged with leaving the country illegally and inciting strikes. At his trial, he stood before the judge and said, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The world watched. The regime trembled. Mandela was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But this was not the end. It was the calm before the storm. Because while he was behind bars, the police uncovered secret ANC documents linking him to the militant campaign. The state was preparing something far more devastating. And Mandela's next trial would decide his fate. The year was 1963. In a quiet suburb of Johannesburg known as Rivonia, police raided a farmhouse. Inside, they found documents, plans, and blueprints. It was the headquarters of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the militant arm of the ANC. It held the movement's secrets. And now, it was in the hands of the enemy. With this evidence, the government launched what would become the infamous Rivonia trial. Mandela, already in prison, was dragged back to court, this time with 10 co-defendants. The charge, sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. The maximum penalty, death. For months, the courtroom in Pretoria became the front lines of South Africa's conscience. The prosecution painted Mandela as a terrorist. But Mandela did not flinch. He knew this was no longer just a legal fight. It was a chance to speak to the world. And then came the most powerful moment of the entire trial. On April 20th, 1964, Mandela stood to make his final statement. He did not deny his actions. He did not beg for mercy. Instead, he delivered a speech that shook history. He spoke of being born a free man, of how he had loved life, the mountains, the freedom to walk where he wished, and how that freedom was stripped away, not just from him, but from all black South Africans. Then he said the words that echoed around the world. "During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." There was silence. The judge looked down. The verdict came. Mandela and his comrades were found guilty, but the world's pressure had an effect. Instead of death, they were sentenced to life imprisonment. Mandela was sent to Robben Island, a windswept prison off the coast of Cape Town. The cells were cold and tiny. The food was meager. Prisoners were forced to break rocks under the sun. Letters from family were rare. No newspapers. No news. Mandela was 44 years old. He would remain behind bars for 27 years. Yet, it was in this cold prison that Mandela became more than a leader. He became a symbol. Over the years, word of his dignity spread. Guards noted his calm strength. Prisoners drew courage from his discipline. Outside the walls, his name appeared on posters, on placards, and in songs. Free Nelson Mandela became a global cry. And inside, he never lost hope. He studied. He wrote. He mentored young inmates. He planted a garden. Even in prison, he kept organizing, turning Robben Island into what some called Mandela University. But change was slow. Years passed. His children grew up without him. His mother died. His son died. He was not allowed to attend the funerals. Yet still he endured. By the late 1980s, the world had changed. The apartheid regime was weakened, isolated by sanctions and pressure. Inside South Africa, protests erupted. International icons demanded his release. In 1990, South Africa's president, F.W. de Klerk, finally gave in. After 27 years, Mandela was free. He walked out of prison, tall and steady, holding Winnie's hand. The world watched in awe. But freedom would come at a price. Mandela was about to face the hardest challenge of all, not fighting his enemies, but forgiving them. When Nelson Mandela emerged from Victor Verster prison in 1990, it was not as a broken man, but as a symbol of hope, restraint, and wisdom. But South Africa was on the brink of civil war. Black townships were exploding with anger. Militants wanted revenge. White conservatives were arming themselves, terrified of losing power. Mandela, newly released, could have fanned the flames. He could have rallied his people to storm the gates of power. Instead, he took a different path, the path of reconciliation. This decision would be Mandela's greatest act of courage. He began negotiations with the same government that had imprisoned him for nearly 3 decades. He met face to face with de Klerk and other apartheid leaders. The talks were tense. Distrust ran deep. Every step forward was met with resistance, protests, even assassinations. And yet, Mandela remained focused. He called on his followers to lay down arms. He asked for calm when anger boiled over. He comforted grieving families and urged patience. Some in the ANC accused him of being too soft. Others feared he was being manipulated. But Mandela understood something deeper. That true leadership was not about vengeance. It was about vision. In 1993, the unimaginable happened. Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk shared the Nobel Peace Prize. The world cheered, but South Africa still held its breath. And then, in 1994, the country held its first democratic elections. Millions of black South Africans stood in line for hours, some for the first vote of their lives. Some wept, some danced. It was a moment the nation had dreamed of, but few believed they would live to see. Nelson Mandela won by a landslide. At 75 years old, he became South Africa's first black president. His inauguration was broadcast worldwide. Kings, presidents, and poets gathered. But Mandela did not gloat. He raised his fist not in triumph, but in unity. He appointed members of the former regime to his cabinet. He visited white neighborhoods and Afrikaner communities. He stood beside those who once called him a terrorist and called them partners. One of his boldest acts was inviting the Springboks, the national rugby team, long a symbol of white pride, to become a unifying symbol. He even wore their jersey. At the 1995 Rugby World Cup, held in South Africa. The mostly white crowd chanted his name. It was a moment that stunned the world. Mandela had done something nearly impossible. He had turned prison into power, rage into reconciliation, and a divided nation into one people. But even after the cheers faded, the work of healing continued. Because legacies are not built in moments. They are built in lifetimes of sacrifice. Nelson Mandela's presidency from 1994 to 1999 was not the story of a ruler imposing power. It was the story of a healer mending a broken soul. For decades, apartheid had scarred South Africa. Communities were torn apart. Trust was shattered. Entire generations had known only separation, fear, and suspicion. Mandela understood that political victory meant little without national healing. So he launched one of the most revolutionary projects of reconciliation in modern history, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC. Led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the TRC invited both victims and perpetrators to come forward. There would be no mass revenge, no secret prisons. Instead, there would be truth. Publicly, painfully, openly. Victims shared their stories of torture, murder, and loss. Former apartheid enforcers admitted their crimes, sometimes tearfully, sometimes coldly. It was not perfect. It was not painless. But it was human. And it taught the world that forgiveness is not forgetting. It is remembering, without hatred. Meanwhile, Mandela tackled the staggering inequality left by apartheid. Under his leadership, millions of people gained access to clean water and electricity for the first time. Housing projects expanded in poor areas. New schools were built. A strong constitution was adopted, protecting the rights of all citizens, regardless of color, gender, or religion. Internationally, Mandela became the voice of justice and compassion. He supported peace efforts across Africa. He defended the rights of children. He became a global ambassador for HIV/AIDS awareness, especially after the heartbreaking death of his son from the disease. But what made Mandela even more extraordinary was what he did not do. He did not seek to remain in power. In 1999, after just one term, he voluntarily stepped down from the presidency. In a continent often scarred by dictators and lifelong rulers, this act was profound. He left office with dignity and gave democracy room to grow. Mandela chose instead to be a moral elder, a guiding light. He created the Nelson Mandela Foundation, which focused on peace, social justice, and education. Even in his old age, he remained a bridge between worlds, a man who could dine with royalty one day and sit with orphans the next. Yet Mandela was no saint. He said so himself. I am not a saint, unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying. He was a man of deep flaws, but even deeper purpose. And that is what made his achievements not just impressive, but humanly heroic. But the story of Mandela's legacy doesn't end there. Because even as his voice grew quieter, his influence grew louder. And the world would soon face the moment it feared most, the moment it would have to say goodbye. On December 5, 2013, at the age of 95, Nelson Mandela passed away at his home in Johannesburg. The world paused. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop, as if even history itself was holding its breath. From villages in South Africa to the halls of the United Nations, candles were lit, flags were lowered, children wept, presidents and poets spoke his name with reverence. But Mandela's true memorial was not built from stone or gold. It was built from values. What did Mandela teach us? 1. The power of forgiveness. After 27 years in prison, Mandela emerged without bitterness. He shook hands with his jailers. He invited his enemies to share power. His forgiveness was not weakness. It was a weapon more powerful than any army. 2. Resilience in the face of darkness. He endured injustice, isolation, and loss. Yet he never let despair define him. His strength came not from avoiding hardship, but from rising again and again despite it. 3. Vision over vengeance. When South Africa was teetering on the edge of civil war, Mandela chose a path of peace. He showed that leadership is not about domination, but about dignity, compassion, and unity. 4. Sacrifice for a greater good. He sacrificed his family, freedom, and years of his life, not for power, but for principle. He showed that personal suffering can be transformed into collective hope. 5. Legacy through service. Even after presidency, he worked to uplift others through education, healthcare, and human rights. He proved that true greatness lies in service. Mandela's legacy lives in every child who goes to school freely, in every leader who chooses dialogue over war, and in every person who dares to stand up when silence is easier. In South Africa, his birthday, July 18th, is now Nelson Mandela International Day, a time when people are asked to spend 67 minutes doing good, one for each year Mandela devoted to public service. And around the world, his name has become a symbol of hope, spoken in moments of struggle and triumph alike. He belongs not just to South Africa, but to all of humanity. And perhaps his most powerful message is this: it always seems impossible until it's done. Dear learners, you have just completed the journey of one of the greatest stories ever told. Nelson Mandela was more than a man. He was a mirror of our best potential, a reminder that even in the darkest prison, a light can shine. He showed us that change does not begin with armies or anger. It begins with the courage to believe in a better future, to speak when silence is safer, to stand when it's easier to sit. From a small rural village to a jail cell to the presidential palace, Mandela walked a path carved by purpose and guided by principle. And as we reflect on his life, ask yourself, what injustice will you stand against? What fear will you overcome? What legacy will you leave? Because you don't have to be a president to lead. You don't have to be imprisoned to understand freedom. And you don't have to wait for the world to change. You can be the one who changes it. So as you go forward, carry his message with you. Hope, unity, freedom, forgiveness, courage. Share Mandela's story. Carry forward his message. In your words, in your actions, in your heart. If this story moved you, tell someone. Share it with a friend. Talk about it with your family. Let Mandela's legacy continue, not just through history books, but through human connection. And if this journey helped you grow, not just in English, but in soul, then let us continue walking together. Like this video. Share your favorite Mandela quote in the comments. Subscribe to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. We'll be back with another incredible story of resilience, courage, and inspiration. Until next time, keep learning, keep dreaming, and never forget, you have the power to overcome. Goodbye for now.